All right, we're back with another build guide, this time with the Lizardmen. So if you haven't watched one of these before, really quickly, there's two parts of the video. One where I go through every single unit and talk about their ideal use cases, whether or not they're currently strong on this patch, notwithstanding. Just like what is this unit supposed to do if it is currently strong. And then the second part will do some good builds and matchups on this patch, right? So let's get started. Grabbing up some of the lords. Lizardmen have a very diverse lord roster. For your generic melee lords, not casters, we have Nakai the Wanderer. Very fast, hard to catch, terror-causing piece, decent-ish duelist, better at just causing mass disruption and being a wrecking ball. His amazing attack animations plus high mass make him easy to get out of bad situations. And his good combat stats make it hard to lock him down like cavalry because he can beat up most cavalry quite nicely. He has some various buffs and debuffs for his allies around him or enemies that happen to be nearby. So he's just kind of the stat stick that runs around the battlefield causing chaos. His cheaper version is the Kroxigor Ancient, a little bit more of a duelist, has some more focused duelist type things, but still has some debuffs, still has some buffs, all those attributes, though he has less good animations than Nakai, making him easier to trap and lock down. Kroxigor Ancient's just a cheaper Nakai. Gorok is the best stand and fight foot lord that the Lizardmen can bring to their roster. Very high combat stats, especially in the melee defense department. Has a bunch of ways of making himself tankier, and nearby allies benefit a little bit of it as well. His only problem is that he is a foot combat lord, so he has a hard time affecting the map at large. The battle has to kind of come to him for him to get much done. Other combat lords, you have the Saurus Oldblood, generic Kroxigor, some basic melee attack and melee defense buffs you can offer nearby allies. Otherwise, you can ride a Carnosaur or a Cold One to get him around the map and offer armor piercing. He is okay, not a great duelist, more of a general of your forces. Red Crest Skink Chief is your cheapest lord option in general. Get him down to 650 gold if you take him butt naked. High stats, anti-large, armor piercing, and can have Warrior's Crest give him a bunch more melee stats, so he's a good little duelist, but at a low HP pool and low armor point, he is susceptible to spells or anti-infantry. Infantry can be a little tricky, but he can be flying on his Ripperdactyl or on a giant monster of the Ancient Stegodon, so at least the Red Crest Skink Chief does have options. Tic-Tac-Toe can only be flying on his Pterodon. Has to be up in the skies. Other than that, he has some aerial buffs. He wants to buff up your flying units, debuff enemy flying units, and win the sky fight. It's roughly all he does. Good little cheap duelist. I mean, he is also pretty cheap. 800 for a flying armor-piercing duelist. Oxyotl is another foot lord. No mount options. He is your ranged skirmish lord. Magic damage, high missile strength, and his blowpipe. He can be actually a pretty good sniper for a relatively cheap price point. 1,000 gold's not nothing, but for 480 missile strength, that's decent. His range is pretty good. His melee stats are somewhat high, but his low HP pool and armor hurt him a lot more than the melee defense and melee attack would imply, so you really don't want him to get any sort of melee fight at all. Kroxigor is your final non-caster lord. The best duelist you probably have on this roster. Hand of the Gods is great at sniping out single entities, chariots, or heavy cavalry and infantry. It almost always gets its value back, so it is worth taking and just firing it at long range towards something expensive. He has some small buffs to help his dueling out, but honestly, these usually just get cut to make him a little cheaper. He can ride a T-Rex for only 2,000 total gold. That's not bad. Or you can ride a horned one or a cold one if you want him to be lower to the ground and a little cheaper. On to your casters, we have Tehenowin, the Beast's caster Skink Lord. Can take an Engine of the Gods, Stegodon, Ripperdactyl to fly, or a horned one just to move around like a horse with armor piercing. So that's kind of nice. Again, like the Red Crest Skink Chief, he just has options to keep your opponent guessing how he's going to come at him. Has some decent tankiness buffs. Is meant to be just a bit of a tanky caster, not that good of a fighter. So if you want a Beast caster Skink, you can take him. Lord Mazdamundi is the best box-breaking or heavy infantry killing Slann you have access to, with this special Ruination of Cities spell that can kill a ton of infantry very quickly, though it is a little RNG dependent. He also has Bound Banishment of most Slanns, and the good buff spells and Winds of Magic generation that Slanns often bring. His own Lore of Magic is a mix of high and light, and heavens, I guess. Yeah, heavens, high, and light. a unique spell kit for sure. Has self-healing through Apotheosis, net, which is often useful, and then some stat buffs if he really needs them. Can ride Zlok and become a fearsome melee combatant, though that does, as you see, make him very, very expensive. And finally, the Slann Mage Priests, who have access to a lot of Winds of Magic lores, making them incredibly versatile. You do see these guys quite often in Lizardmen games just because of the amount of different strategies you can bring due to their magic access. Like, Lore of Fire is great versus box factions or low leadership factions, while Death is great versus elven factions who bring more elite units you can hit with Fate of Buna. Still has the Bound Banishment. It can even get Bound Blood Statuette of Spites, just some guaranteed damage on another elite unit. Slanns are some of the best magic casters in the entire game, and you have access to many options with them. For your heroes, we have some more magic casters in case you take one of the melee lords. Skink Priest of Beasts, a far, far worse magic caster than the Slanns, but they get the job done. You can get Beasts or Heavens for your lores. Less options there. You can get an Ancient Stegodon or a Stegodon with the Engine of the Gods, so you can be pretty tanky with the Skinks, but those mount options are rather expensive. Very, very expensive, especially considering you don't have the cheapest lords either, so it's risky to put your Skink up on a big dinosaur like that. For other magic casters, you can get the Skink Oracle. The only way to get healing spells not in your lord slot, he can bring Earthblood, but he has a wildly mixed lore of magic. Beasts, Fire, Heavens, and Earth. Life magic. He has to be riding a Troglodyte, so he does have a high missile strength skirmish mount, but it's pretty bad in melee and weak to basic archers. Good at killing blobs. Then there's Lord Croak. Lord Croak has a unique lore of magic, the Deliverance of Itza, and he has a Supreme Shield, the old ones, just a different damage resist aura than the regular Slanns can bring. His Golden Death Mask and Great Arcane Conduit are also nice little buffs, but yeah. Lord Croak is an unbreakable undead Slann with very poor melee stats, low armor, and low-ish HP. Just bring him if you want to blow up a blob of infantry, for the most part. Then you have your anti-large duelist, the Saurus of Scar Veteran. I feel like everybody's getting Colossal Strike nowadays, but alright. You can get ITP and extra bonus versus large. Has a -8 leadership debuff he can offer. Obviously, you can take a Carnosaur for even higher stats, or just a Cold One mount. The Carnosaur doesn't get that much more weapon strength than his Cold One, which I find hard to justify paying for him then, but it does have nearly double the HP. Lastly, a Skink Chief. Oxyotl, but much, much worse. Skink Chief just has a light missile strike that he can use to constantly poke at things. He's okay on foot or on his Pterodon. I find it hard to justify a Stegodon or Ancient Stegodon because then 360 poke isn't as important, and now you just have an Ancient Stegodon with not a lot of good buffs. I don't see the point in that. On to the infantry. Skinks, Skinks, Skinks. For your basic Skinks, you have Skink Cohorts, Red Crest Skinks, Chameleon Stalkers, and the Court of Sotek Red Crest Skink ROR. Basic Skinks are cheap-ish, shielded, light armored, and that is about it. They have pitiful melee stats, they do very, very little damage, and they don't hold for particularly long. They're only useful if you're going to swarm the enemy and get around their defenses and just get around, get around, harass archers, be a nuisance, I guess. But they aren't winning any fights. Red-crested Skinks, on the other hand, will win some fights with Frenzy and armor-piercing stats, plus poison and immune to contact effects. These guys can actually trade up rather effectively. Still a little expensive for how squishy they are. 30 armor, no shields, 8,000 HP. You have to be careful about not letting them just get hit with spells or blasting charges or something like that. But straight up melee fights, Red-crested Skinks will do what you need them to do. They're your pseudo-berserker infantry on this roster. The Court of Sotek is just them with higher stats and refuse to die. They have this thing that they can pop where their models can't die when they're hit with something. It can be kind of cheeky. It's hard to make really work, but, you can just stop losing models for a bit, keep your full combat effectiveness. And another big thing they get is Unbreakable, which when they have Frenzy, just means Frenzy will never wear off, so they constantly have plus 10 melee attack, constantly have plus 10% damage. And that is nice, because you can see it's enabled if your leadership's higher than 50%, which Unbreakable can't move. And finally, Chameleon Stalkers are kind of meant to be your assassin infantry. They have these fire grenades that they can throw before they hit a front line and then run in there and do some damage. Decent melee defense. Pretty low weapon strength. Does make it hard to get kills on all but like archers. These guys are best at hunting down defenseless units per se, like archers or already routing infantry or something like that, rather than taking on a full health opponent. Onto the Saurus front line. So you can take Saurus warriors or Saurus spears, or give them shields for 50 more gold. You get bronze shield and +6 melee defense, which is usually quite worth it. Spears are better at holding and better versus large targets, obviously. Saurus warriors are better at just grinding through infinite amounts of light infantry slightly faster. Neither of these units moves particularly fast. They're more about being tanky. Think of them kind of like Nurgle's Plague Bearers rather than Berserkers or anything like that. High weapon strength, decent stats, high HP pools, decent-ish armor for 800 or 750 price point, but it's a slow grind. They're not going to blitz through anything. Legion of Chakwas is the ROR spears. They have a special AoE shield that increases missile resistance by 40%, which can be really significant, especially in blob builds where you have like a Dread Saurian or a Slan that you want to protect with Legion of Chakwa, and the opponent has missiles. You can just pop that Shield of Chakwa and deflect a lot of shots, even artillery. And then there's Temple Guard, which have a pretty unique thing. If they're next to a lord or hero, they get ITP and cause fear, and the ROR Star Chamber Guardians get unbreakable if they're near a lord or hero, which is quite nice. These are your elite halberds. They are more defensive than offensive, slightly higher armor than other Saurus, silver shields, anti-large, armor piercing, charge defense, charge reflection, all the good stuff. They also have Guardian, so if they're next to your lord, they give 15% physical resistance to that lord. Limited melee stats, though. They do not like fighting other infantry. With only 31 melee attack, they have a hard time versus even medium infantry. So they need to be fighting large targets. Star Chamber Guardians, just magic damage, higher stats, unbreakable if near your lord. Otherwise, they're just Temple Guard. Missile Infantry. You have two Skirmish Infantry, Skink Skirmishers, and Chameleon Skinks. Both are 360 shooting, poison damage at low range, decent speed. Chameleon Skinks just have a little bit higher DPS. They're more reliable, feels like. Same ammunition, but Chameleon Skinks, while they have less HP, they have 40% missile resistance, which is quite nice. They don't take much damage from opponents shooting at them. They need to avoid light cavalry and dogs, but they can kite out most infantry, and they can take decent, range damage with that missile resistance. They'll dodge a lot of it. Stalked, good damage. Chameleon Skinks have a ton of ammunition too, so they'll usually keep firing until the game is over. Skink Skirmishers is all the same stuff, but they're just cheaper, don't have stock, don't have as much damage, don't have missile resistance. So keep them away from dogs and light cavalry and they'll do okay. They're great at supporting infantry or monster fights because they'll just poke in with poison, apply poison, reducing the enemy's stats, which not that many of your infantry actually have poison. Just the red crested skinks and chameleon stalkers do. But if you're supporting Saurus or skink cohorts, poison is quite nice. Or your cold one cav. Skink cohorts of javelins are just your regular 325 skink cohorts. They have all the same stats, except the skink cohorts of javelins have a 3 ammunition javelin that they throw. It is a lot of damage, honestly. It stacks up with 160 models and 16 missile strength. That'll wreck something, especially if it's light armor. So these guys are good. Just don't treat them as pure archer units. You do have to throw their couple javelins quick and then run into melee. As archers, they just don't have a lot of ammunitions. You can't really use them as, standing DPS that's going to maintain through the whole game. You don't really want to bother defending these guys either. Like, they're just chaff units. Throw the javelins and deal with whatever problems are in front of you. The Cavalry. Very similar cavalry in a lot of aspects. So we have feral cold ones. Cold One Riders with spears, and Horned One Riders, which are cold ones but with more stats. All of these have the same base model. Feral cold ones are just Cold One Cavalry with pretty low stats and a low model count, only 32 models, 5,000 HP. Super cheap armor piercing with okay-ish stats, high armor, especially for a 500 gold thing. The only problem is that it'll rampage itself and often get into bad situations, but, really cheap, fast armor piercing you can use. They're quite terrible at chasing down enemy units. With their low model count and large size, they're just not as good as at killing archers that are running away as dogs are. So they'll take a long time to finish that unit and come back. Also lowish speed for a war beast unit. Cold One Riders, just higher stats versions of your feral cold ones with a rider on top. They will not rampage into a bad spot, which is quite nice for you. So they'll stay focused, stay on task. At 850 gold, they have a solid weapon strength full of armor piercing that outperforms most other heavy cav in the game right now, with multiple buffs for themselves. Predatory Fighter if someone routes. Primal Instincts if their HP is dipping. Golden Spear Rider is a lot of the same, except they have an anti-large bonus. Lesser generalist stats, so you don't want to chuck Golden Spear Riders just into infantry and hope for the best, but they make up for it with a significant bonus versus large, so they're great at fighting other cavalry. They get 40 base melee attack against other cav, which is great with their high armor piercing values. They're amazing. Good job, Golden Spear Riders. The Pak Hopak cohort recently just got... Pak Hopak cohort recently just got a buff. They now have Devastating Flanker, giving them double charge bonus when they are hitting something in the rear. That's decent. I mean, their charge bonus of 32 is not very good, so at least doubling it to 64 can be significant. Immune to Psychology, Cause Fear, and then higher stats. And then the Horned Ones. Horned Ones are the highest stats of the Cold One Cavalry. They are held back a little bit by their low melee defense, meaning they take a lot of damage, and they don't have the highest HP pool for a cavalry unit. They make up for it a little bit with high weapon strength and melee attack. These are the most elite cavalry the Lizardmen are going to get, so they can take cav-cav duels decently well. And without relying on a bonus versus large, just having naturally high melee attack, they can also kill a lot of elite infantry. For flying cavalry, you have Riperdactyl Riders. Armor piercing, anti-infantry, very high melee attack, plus frenzy. These guys can hit anything and do a lot of damage, but they are incredibly squishy. Low HP pool, low armor, low melee defense. Even dog units can run up on these guys when they're on the ground and tear them apart. So you do have to treat them as flying assassins. They can't just jump into a fight and stay there till the end. They'll probably die. But if you use them to rear charge archers, use them to follow up on some Cold One cavalry engagements, you know, they fly in behind the enemy cavalry that's stuck fighting your Cold Ones, and then they make sure that the cavalry can't escape, they'll do very well at that. Slightly more elite, the Clostodon Hunters. Higher stats, but they mostly have Toad Rage. 50% damage increase as long as you rampage yourself. That sounds like you're making a trade-off, but on this roster, Lizardmen have the most rampage deterrent in the entire game. Most of their lords and heroes have Cold-Blooded that just stops you from rampaging. So if you cast Cold-Blooded on them and then cast Toad Rage, the rampage just won't proc, and they'll get 50% more damage on a pretty low cooldown. It's very, very nice. So these guys are strong. A little bit of flying unit jank can hold them back, so be careful if you're trying to attack a small target. They'll just cluster around it and then flap their wings, but not really get too many attacks off. But overall, a great unit. Monsters and Beasts. Oh, significant portion of the roster, which makes sense. But it is rosters and beasts, yes. Monsters and beasts. I don't know why some of these units aren't popping up when I double click them. Lizardmen have a lot of scary, spooky dinosaurs. Some of them are also in the missile monster category. For these monsters, let's tackle the multi-entity models first, the Croxagores. You have regular Croxagores, which are giant alligators wielding axes. They have good armor piercing, tanky stats. They're great at running into a front line and then standing there for an awfully long time with high leadership and armor. They're hard to dislodge, and they do have a buff when they're near skinks, which you'll often have skinks, where they get 10% more damage. That's all nice. These guys aren't going to blitz through a front line, though. They are more static. They're better at holding an area. With a high weapon strength but slow attacks and low melee stats, they don't churn through infantry that quickly. Their more berserker cousins are the Sacred Croxagores. Higher stats in general. Magic damage does better against demons, but they also just kind of have better attack animations and better charge animations as well. Sacred Croxagores will blitz through a front line a little quicker than the basic Croxagores, where the basic Croxagores a little cheaper. They're more of just holding action. Finally, the Arwar Sacred Croxagore, the Cord of Hwaddle. Really good support unit with Dazed. Anything it touches takes -10 melee defense and -25% speed. So anything around it is slowed and weakened. Then they have crazy high melee stats, really high and good armor piercing, and these guys have perfect vigor, meaning their stats will always stay that high, especially their leadership, which is naturally at 85, making them nearly unbreakable as far as a bodyguard unit goes. You often see these defending slons from large predatory diving units like manticores or dragons. The Sacred Croxagore ROR is usually nearby to surround that unit, beat the crap out of it, and allow the slon to get to safety. Next up to the supportive dinosaurs, the Bastillodons. So your Feral Bastillodon is crazy cheap, insanely tanky with amazingly high armor, a decent HP pool, but most importantly, it is a teeny tiny little model. Feral Bastillodons are so small it is hard to surround them with cavalry or monstrous infantry. They just want to avoid halberds. If you don't walk into infantry halberds, you will have a good time with these guys. 28 melee defense sounds pretty bad, but they are immune to flanking, so when they're surrounded, they don't take any of the penalties. keeping their leadership decently high. They can rampage. That is a bit of a downside, but overall, you want to fire these at the enemy front line and then forget about them. At their crazy cheap price point and the fact that they cause terror, they will cause enough disruption to be worth it for sure. There are two variants that have a little bit more going on. Still, an Ark of Sotek has an occasional little vortex it can spawn at its feet that does damage. And what is nice about it is it applies a specific poison. So Sotek's poison is a different poison than regular. So minus 15% damage, minus 15% speed, and that stacks with the little javelin skinks on their back that are constantly throwing out poison to everyone around them. So pretty much whenever this thing jumps into combat and pops its vortex, everything around it does 30% less damage to anything and takes a 30% speed debuff. It's brutal. The still Rev Crystal is more supportive than its Ark of Sotek compatriot, though I suppose he has some support capabilities with his double poison. This thing offers healing for the Lizardmen. If you didn't want to bring a Slann or the Skink Oracle for their healing, you can grab a Rev Crystal. 7-time use, single target heal. It's not quite as good as a regrowth, but it is a solid heal. It only works on Lizardmen units. It can resurrect dead combatants if all your other combatants are currently at full HP, though I really haven't seen that taking effect because something is always slightly wounded in some capacity. We have other Bastiladons, but those are in the missile section, so we'll get there when we get there. For your melee Stegodons, we have the Feral Stegodon and the Ancient Stegodon. Feral Stegodon, 1,000 gold for a slightly better melee Feral Bastiladon. Higher melee stats, still causes terror, still high armor, still high damage. Low melee attack, melee defense, but it has 70 charge bonus, where the Feral Bastiladon only has 34. So this thing is better at cycle charging through units than the little Bastiladon is. Though he is also bigger, making it easier for cavalry or monstrous infantry to get surrounds on him, and more of the missiles that are shooting at him are going to hit. Ancient Stegodon, Engine of the Gods, is a Stegodon that is not feral, so it will not rampage. It has slightly higher melee stats, I think. Yeah, higher armor, higher health, higher leadership. Has a little missile attack on its back, but you're mostly taking this 4 Winds of Magic power generation, plus 5 damage resistance for everyone around it. Oh yeah, and a giant frickin' sky laser beam that zips right through enemy armies. You have 2 casts of it, and it can kill almost any infantry with 100% armor piercing in one go. It is decently easy to dodge if you're fighting a human opponent, but in campaign, they're pretty sick. And online, they're not terrible anymore. They got some buffs. That laser moves a lot faster than it used to. Rest of the melee monsters, we have recently buffed Carnosaurs. Carnosaurs are supposed to be your anti-large armor-piercing hunters. They're supposed to hunt down other large single entities and beat the crap out of them. They have Frenzy and bonus socials large and a very high melee attack. So they should have 90 melee attack base, 100 melee attack when they have Frenzy on versus any large units. They should never miss. They should be able to hunt it down and lock on. I suppose that's the Geplom's Terror. The regular one has 10 less, so 90 melee attack. Ooh. So terrible. They are a little pricey, so you have to be careful. Can't just let them overextend and die. And they are much better at taking on 1v1s or maybe cavalry fights, but they're very bad at clearing out infantry, and they are weak to getting shot with no shields and only 95 armor. 95 sounds like a lot, but when you're that big and archers are going to fire a lot of arrows at you, it adds up. These guys can get taken down. Might want to pair them with some healing support, either a Rev Crystal or a Life Slan. Yeah, they'll do okay. Geplom's Terror is just higher stats, and then it does not have Rampage, and it has Vanguard deployment. Quaddles. Spirit of Tepok and a regular Quaddle. Spirit of Tepok just has higher stats and different spells. Earthblood and Barona's Time Warp for one-time uses. Well, is it 2 uses of Earthblood? 2 uses of Earthblood. Ooh, fancy. Versus the other one that just has 2 uses of Thunderbolt and 1 Lesser Chain Lightning. The regular Quaddle is amazing at disruption. Its spells are great at disrupting infantry formations. Its charge attacks are incredible at that. And its long serpentine body and flying profile make it hard for a lot of range units to get solid hits on the Quaddle. And when it's on the ground, a lot of melee units struggle to really get a grasp on its sneaky body. Spirit of Tepok has higher stats, but I don't want to make this too much of a meta conversation. You know, we want to keep it generic, but generally the Spirit of Tepok's spells are a little asynergistic with what it wants to do. 2 uses of a generic Earthblood isn't that powerful. It's some healing, but not a lot. And Barona's Time Warp is a one-time use plus 24 melee attack. Okay. Most people would rather have the Lesser Chain Lightning and 2 Thunderbolts just to disrupt infantry formations further, which is what this unit wants to be doing. It's a pretty bad duelist. It's not great at dealing damage at all, but it does disrupt infantry formations quite a lot. You can just use it as a flying chariot monster that's very hard to kill. The Dread Saurians, the biggest, baddest monster in the entire game. Some of the highest HP pools you will find anywhere. You can grab the Feral Dread Saurian for just high melee damage stats. Low melee defense makes it a little susceptible, and its rampage can cause it to wander off into nothingness. Or you can upgrade it for 700 gold, grab the Dread Saurian, and he has the Howdah on his back that has the several Gatling turrets that skinks use to blow out a bunch of poison everywhere, and it applies leadership debuffs and all that stuff. Dread Saurian is fantastic versus everything, honestly. The only thing holding it back is its high price point, but if you ignore cost, this thing has no weaknesses. It can kill everybody and everything for any reason, and its high HP pool usually makes it relatively tanky to artillery. Depends. I mean, if you have 8 cannons shooting at it, then sure, it'll take a ton of damage, but 1 or 2 cannons shooting at it, it can usually get to them and shut them down in time. Does require some healing support or spell support, and since it's so much money, it'll usually limit your army to being support the Dread Saurian at all costs, because it's a quarter of your funds. Shredder of Lustria has increased stats, but most importantly, a lot of people take it for Dread Aversion. A -8 leadership aura, plus his cause terror, does make a lot of people near him run away screaming, which is useful when you're taking down Skaven armies or Beastmen armies or some of the lower leadership armies in the game. The Shredder of Lustria can do very, very well for you. And that is it for the melee monsters. Final section is the missile monsters. You notice that the Lizardmen don't have... Stop texting me! Lizardmen don't have a lot of archer options. They have some light skirmishers. They have a couple ammunition jav throwers. Not a lot of missiles on this roster. So the missile monsters and beasts section is big. It's not that great on focus DPS. For example, you have 3 flying skirmish units. One is the Pterodon Riders. They have these little javelins that they chuck that do okay single target damage. Not that much versus cavalry or infantry. Okay missile strength, not a ton of ammunition, and their melee stats are pitiful, so they're better at jumping in and chasing stuff off that's already routing. You can take them for their drop rocks. You can take them for constant poison support. With only 3,700 HP, you need to be careful not to let them get into a bad situation. The Pox Sentinels is just the Regiment of Renown version of the regular Pterodons, and they have significantly better melee stats and a better drop rocks that provides armor sundering. That's largely it. These guys still have only 3,700 HP and 15 armor, so their higher melee stats doesn't usually save them. If they land on the ground, something is going to beat them to death. And honestly, in the sky, Harpies or Furies will also destroy these guys. So they are flying skirmishers, keep them out of melee. Fireleech Bolas, significantly better than their counterparts. Their explosive fire ammunition is better at punishing blobs, like when infantry end up fighting each other and they're in that straight line. If you fly over the infantry and start firing backwards into them, you'll get some really good damage out, or punishing pockets of cavalry that form. So these guys are better blob punishment, and their fire damage is a nice little application if you're fighting someone who has a lot of healing, like Nurgle or Tomb Kings. You can just keep their healing from being that effective. For the ground-based weapons teams, quote-unquote, we have the Salamander and Razordon hunting packs. Razordon hunting packs are armor-piercing, anti-infantry, anti-large monster units. If it is armored and visible, these guys will do incredible damage to it, but they're short range and bad line of sight. They need to have direct line of sight to what's going on. They usually need to be kiting infantry, or they'll be obstructed. They can't see over their own lines. And if you go out around the side and start firing inwards, they're usually susceptible to damage from enemy archers or cavalry or dogs. They're also great at taking down large monsters. Obviously, that line of sight is not a problem if something is gigantic. So Razordon hunting packs can pincushion big monsters that are trying to rampage through your front line. They can do okay against monstrous infantry. The monstrous infantry, you sometimes run into, I'm obstructed for no reason, which is a bit of a hassle. The MXon Barbs are the same unit, just have some missile resistance, but not enough to justify taking them for the missile resistance. If you're like, I'll take this and then I can ignore archers. No, 15% is not a lot. They also have poison and higher leadership, higher missile strength. Salamander hunting pack on the other end do almost no damage to infantry. They do not fight infantry well at all. Their shots don't do that much damage to clumps of infantry. It doesn't matter how clumped up they are. These guys kind of suck at killing them. They are anti-large missiles. that are great at shooting enemy cavalry, enemy light cavalry, enemy heavy cavalry. They still do okay. Large monsters, especially large unarmored monsters, and their fire damage can make them great at killing monstrous infantry that are weak to fire, like trolls. These guys are your large killers. It's kind of like the Lizardons. The Lizardons are kind of good at killing large units, great at killing infantry. These guys are kind of good at killing monsters, great at killing light cavalry and lightly armored monsters. So yeah, but they're terrible against infantry. They can often get more shots off because their arc of fire is better, so they can see over their own front line. Makes them a little more reliable than your Lizardons. The Umbral Tide is a little better, has a lot more of the same stats as the other guy, but they also have Perfect Vigor, which keeps their stats nice and high, melee attack and melee defense, especially their leadership. And they also have Stalk to keep them safe from archers and artillery while they get in position to fire. Whew! For your single entity artillery pieces, we have the Ancient Salamander. Mostly anti-infantry, fires one big fireball up and over a formation, hits a clump, does a lot of damage to the clump, and moves on. Does not do that much damage versus single entities. And his low HP pool and not great melee stats, not even that great of armor, honestly, make him very squishy to anything that can shoot at him or get in melee with him. But his high speed and responsiveness makes him a scoot and shoot unit. So he wants to avoid all melee contact and wants to dodge range shots, which he is very capable of doing. Exact opposite is the Bastildon Solar Engine. This thing is a weird corpse cart supportive tank nowadays. He can't move to save his life, but his high armor and decent missile resistance, slightly higher HP pool than the Salamander. He's not going to dodge anything, but he can usually just withstand whatever's shooting at him unless it's focused anti-armor fire. He does have a little solar beam he can fire out with 20 ammunition. It does magic damage and fire damage, which is great versus demons or things weak to fire. But he is mostly a giant support unit. His fire damage ammunition can cancel someone's healing. If they're getting, like you see the Demigryph Knight getting a regrowth, you can fire one of these at him and reduce the healing by 50%. He also has a debuff, minus 24 melee defense and melee attack and accuracy when he hits something. So speaking of the Demigryph Knights, if they're getting in a fight with your Cold One Knights and you're worried about them losing, you can just fire this at them, lower their stats and make them a little more susceptible. Plus he has a Vigor Regeneration aura around him. So the units he's nearby also get like Perfect Vigor and get their Vigor back as long as they're near the Solar Engines. The Solar Engine has a lot of various support capabilities. As an actual damage piece, he's not really that good. You don't usually take him to like snipe something out or kill an entire enemy army or counterfire skirmish cav. He just doesn't do enough damage there. Speaking of doing damage, we have more Stegodons. This Stegodon, yes, okay, the regular Stegodon has a bolt thrower on its back where it fires one missile that does a lot of damage at a longer range, 360 range. Other than that, it is still a tanky, terror-causing duelist monster that can kill a lot of infantry and cavalry, but he is weak to missiles, and he is pretty expensive, so you want to be careful with the Stegodon and not just send it into a bad fight. But, I mean, if light cavalry come out to stop it from shooting, it can largely ignore them. Though, all this comes at the cost that its missile strength isn't actually that high. Its missile damage is pretty whatever and negligible by the enemy. Slightly more damage at a shorter range. The Ancient Stegodon is the machine gun turret version. Instead of a single bolt thrower, it's this little Gatling gun that's on its back and fires. Higher missile strength at a lower range. Similar melee stats? Very similar melee stats. So nothing really different to say on the melee front. It's just a machine gun version with lower range. And then the Thunderous one, higher melee stats than the other Ancient Stegodon or the Stegodon, but it also has this Judgment of the Uxmak 10-use bombardment around it. These lightning bolts just land on the ground and absolutely shred armored units. So if heavy cav get in a fight with him, if heavy infantry get in a fight with him, if he's in a blob fight, he'll do great there. People just tend to use the Thunderous one as a melee Stegodon. They don't really bother with like trying to use it as a ranged platform. And your last two units are the Feral Troglodon and the Pale Death. Really quickly, the Pale Death has Primeval Roar, giving it slightly more melee attack stats and higher stats. That's about it. Otherwise, these are the same unit. Troglodons are mid to short range burst units with a very high missile strength. They have these little sniper spit things they can do that can snipe out big single entities for the most part, somewhat do damage to elite cavalry, don't do any damage to infantry at all. They have misleading melee stats because these things just don't perform well in melee at all. With 3946 melee stats and 7,500 HP with 95 armor, you would think they're kind of tanky, but I swear, man, if anything catches this out, it dies instantaneously. So the Troglodyte is a kite unit, and with its low range, that means you have to take out the enemy skirmish cav and then the archers, but then you can back off and the Troglodyte can kill everything the opponent has that's good, and then you can sweep up the chaff afterwards. Whew! There you go. Lizardmen. Let's make up some builds, huh? Demons of Chaos. How would the lizards deal with the Demons of Chaos? I think Nakai's good here. His Miasma of Despair is very good. Damage resistance is fine, so I take him with just these two. Miasma of Despair, -8 leadership to get the demonic instability crumbling to start working on some of those units. Then I would take a Skink Priest, put him on just foot with Flock of Doom, Wild Heart, keep him super cheap. This can kill off a lot of your enemies' blue horrors, nurglings, plague bearers if they go with like a blob, because Demons of Chaos can try and blob versus you, or they can go wide with seekers, or they can even go change bringers. So Flock of Doom is always good, especially if they try and blob. Let's grab 6 skirmishers, 2 chameleon skinks, or skink skirmishers in case they try and change bringer cheese you. Flying up in the sky, these guys can do a lot of damage to them for a super cheap price point, and that's relatively fine. For your front line, we don't know what's coming. They might try and kite us with soul grinders. They might try and blob. You can grab 2 Saurus warriors with shields and 3 skink cohorts. So all of your front line is shielded against blue and pink horrors, but I don't know. If they box, then you're not over-investing in infantry that's just going to slowly get ground down by an Exalted Great Unclean One's Mortis Engine Drain or Changebringer shooting them in the back or something. But you still have some infantry in case they try and, like, Nurgling rush you or whatnot. But the problem you're facing when you face Demons of Chaos and you don't want to go too elite is if they bother to fight you in the infantry fight, they'll have Plague Bearers, which is a bit of a wash versus Saurus. That's unlikely, but they might have Bloodletters or Demonettes, which will body Saurus and Skinks alike. You don't want to waste your time on Red Crest Skinks because the armor piercing is wasted versus demons, so this is fine. Coldwind Cavalry is also a little wasted in this matchup. It's generally great cavalry, but versus Seekers specifically, you're going to have a pretty terrible time. So I don't know if we're going to go with too many of those, to be honest. I'll think about it. Could grab a Stegodon to counterfire Soul Grinders. Could grab a Stylodon. Quaddles might be okay. Yeah, Quaddles can do okay. We can just go with the leadership debuff of the Shredder of Lustria, but then I might want a Rev Crystal, which I don't have, but you could try and Shredder of Lustria these guys. That's actually not a terrible idea. Something like this can be solid. Yeah, okay, go with this. So you have Nakai's leadership debuff, you have the Shredder's leadership debuff, and then if the Seekers want to get close to Shredder of Lustria, it'll do enough burst damage to knock those fools out. And then the Rev Crystal can offer a little bit of healing. Your infantry can push up if you need to, and then your skinks skirmish the Seekers or skirmish changelings or whatever they go with. Shredder of Lustria with its collision attacks can power through a lot of light cavalry and light infantry, which are all the demons can really bring to bear. And if they want to blob, be careful to just kite, use all of your ammunition on the blob. Flock of Doom, cast it over and over again until whatever's blobbing is either almost heal capped or dead, and then Nakai and the Shredder of Lustria charge in at the same time and just cause them demonic instability crumble. Then in the late game, you can duel the Great Unclean One that's trying to drain you down with Nakai and the Shredder and win. All right, so that's a lightly armored, diverse faction. Let's find some armored gits. Warriors of Chaos. Oh, Warriors of Chaos. You have to worry about halberd infantry and skirmish cavalry for the most part. Oh, and Archaon. Okay. Armored halberds, skirmish cav, Archaon. Alrighty. Let's get Mazda. Mazda Mundi, put him on Zlak. Keep the Sunburst standard for his missile resistance, because then he also has crazy missile resistance without the Sunburst standard, so now he has 25% from that. Oh yeah, when he's on Zlak, he gets a little less missile resistance. When he's on just butt-naked Mazda, he gets 40. But I want Zlak. I want the HP in case Archaon comes running up on me. For Mazda, let's grab Net and Apotheosis. Whoopsie. Apotheosis to heal himself up when he's in trouble, or heal up some of his elite units, and then Net to lock down those tricky skirmish cavalry. and make sure they suffer a lot of pain. Then we have keep the rest of his stuff. We want Arcane Conduit for more Winds of Magic quicker. And then Banishment, Ruination Cities are counters to Warriors of Chaos, blobs, or something with a bunch of halberds. Chosen with halberds, something like that. So Mazda's set, ready to go. Now to deal with Skirmish Cav, we can grab some Chameleon Skinks and Skink Skirmishers to fire back at them. Those are okay. I'll go 2 and 2. Don't want to overinvest on it. Here, the Red Crested Skink frontline will do fine. Against Warriors of Chaos. Either they have armor or they have basic Marauders, which Red Crested Skinks just beat basic Marauders, and they'll trade up into Chaos Warriors, so this is a good frontline we have. And then, though I generally shit-talk them, we can go triple Salamander Hunting Pack. With Mazda's net, these guys can fire really well against enemy Skirmish Cavalry, and Mazda will just net them and you can kill a Skirmish Cav. That's a fine way of doing things. And if the enemy goes with a double Giant build to try and like duel your Shredder, Salamanders do really good work against Giants, especially with these Skirmishers helping them out. And then for a bit of armor piercing and mobility presence, you can go with 2 Cold One Riders to defend these guys, and you have your own Skirmishers. But that is a little risky, because if they go with dogs or whatnot, it can just be risky. So a little safer is to go with these 4 Skirmishers, and then grab Cold One Spear Riders and Cold One Rider Cav. I need 20 gold back. Ugh, cringe. There, something like that's fine. This is more of a rush build. You'd have to zone out their Skirmish Cavalry with your own Skirmishers, but then if they have any heavy cavalry, your Cold One Riders will do very well against those. If they have heavy infantry, your Cold One Riders can also do fine there when you get good charges in. Dual Dragon Ogre Shaggoths, dual their single entities, so this build can do relatively fine. Cold Ones are just kind of slapping right now. A different way you could do it, if you don't want to over-index in Cold One Cavalry, you can just grab 2 Cold One Spear Riders. At this point, we do need a little something to counterfire cavalry. And then you could grab the Sacred Croxor ROR. Something like that. Or just grab 1 Salamander Hunting Pack and defend it a little better. So, there's a lot of options. Lizardmen are a very diverse and flexible roster. Take care, everybody.
Roar. Subscribe, yes, yes.